Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber kind of comment when I had said that I really wasn't going to cover the Olympia, that hey, maybe I should because, it's a major sporting event, and I just kind of stopped right there. And I realized, I haven't covered that in a while, actually a really long time, of explaining why bodybuilding isn't a sport, and it's not. You shouldn't even call it that. It's kind of silly to call it that. So, let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on some crafting, and let's discuss this. All right, first of all, when you think of sports, obviously sports have changed a lot over the years, but when we talk about the purest and most traditional type of sports, going back historically, the original Olympics, 2,000, 2,500 years ago, times like that, where the history of our modern sports came from, the Olympics. The first sports were really, and therefore anything similar to it, is kind of the purest sports in that sense. Sports were actually supposed to simulate warfare. They were supposed to be training for warfare, and they were supposed to simulate warfare. So single type sports like, running even to some extent is a combat skill, but running, throwing spears, throwing objects, archery, wrestling, boxing, these things were training for combat. And that is essentially what the first athletes were. And when you think about it, in a lot of ways, modern infantry and spec ops guys are in a way professional athletes in their own right. When you think about the training they endure and what they go through. So there's that element of sports. But then there's the other thing, the whole team sport thing, which again, a lot of was actually simulating combat. And that's been all over the world. We think of those as just modern football and stuff, which is like our modern gladiator event. But most team sports, even when we found team sports, evidence of them down in South America, among even the Aztec and Mayan Indians and things, they had team sports that simulated warfare in a sense. And it's really interesting because that seems to be universal around the world because war was such an intrinsic part of our lives historically and really still is today. Even though many of us in first world countries feel detached from it, it really hasn't been that long since there were wars in the streets in many of these first world countries. My grandfathers remembered it. So you've got all of that, but then we have the other definition of a sport. It's usually a competitive athletic endeavor with clearly defined rules with a performance standard involved. You don't see any of that in bodybuilding. In fact, I can tell you that bodybuilding doesn't seem to have any clear rules to determine who even wins. It's a competition, but it's not a competition with clearly defined rules, meaning all the fans can watch who read the rule book and know the rules of most sports, team sports. They can look at and tell if something was legal or not, and if the person successfully completed what they were supposed to complete. They can see the timers, they can see the numbers. They can see a ball go through a hoop. They know when there's penalties given. They know the general rules. Now, they might disagree with the referees sometimes because they get a bad call against their team or their person who they love and they're a fan of. But people generally know the rules. And it's well understood. When you go to bodybuilding, the average fan can't even always tell the rules. They don't know who's supposed to win outside of the politics involved. And that's kind of scary, is that you've got something that's a completely subjective, competitive endeavor with money on the line. And before the people even get there, and we don't know if they're going to have a bad day or an off day or whatever, people you haven't seen compete in 6 months or a year, people already know how they're going to place. They already know how they're going to place. You don't see many upsets. Why? Because it's subjective and there's politics involved. And the judging criteria are not clearly understood and described, which already removes a big aspect of sports in it. Sports are supposed to have clearly defined rule books that all the competitors, all the fans, not just the referees and stuff watching, that everyone can look at and interpret. You don't see that in bodybuilding. It's completely subjective with politics involved, favoritism involved, money involved, with everyone already knowing ahead of time who's going to win what. And they talk about people getting robbed, but not really. It's subjective. Everyone already knows who's going to win it going in. No one's really getting robbed. So you've got that to consider, but then you've got to factor in, well, what about the actual performance? Every sport in the world that you can think of, either that person maintains their competitive peak year-round, depending on what it is, or they're at their very best in competition. They are at the peak of their condition and ability and physical ability at the time they compete. Bodybuilding is the only competitive endeavor that people are trying to call a sport, to where the competitors at the time they compete are at their weakest and performing their worst. There is no athletic element to it being judged, other than a little bit of free posing. But that's purely artistic. That's not so much physical performance as it is an artistic performance, which brings me to the point. Bodybuilding is not a sport. It meets none of the criteria of a sport. It has nothing in common with sports other than people try to call it one. But what it does have in common with other things is that it's a performing art. It is a performing art. And because it's a performing art, when you think of it that way, that's why the judging criteria are subjective, because it's an art form being interpreted. It is a form of art. Now, we could argue that it's not a beautiful form, that it's grotesque, it's hideous, all of that. And that can be a fair assessment. I happen to agree with that. I think it's hideous. But that's really irrelevant because, like all other art forms, beauty's in the eye of the beholder now, isn't it? And there are people who enjoy this and they see it as an artistic thing and they judge it, but they are judging an art form based upon their subjective viewpoint with a few little rules and standards put in place to determine things. So, totally a performing art. And like other performing arts, when they're being judged and compared, any performing art, whether it's ballet or an art show, or even other performing arts like say independent film festivals, these things are rated and judged, but they're artistic. The judges have to decide based upon their subjective view of it who won, because all these other things are performing arts. Some are performing arts with film, some are performing arts with dance, and this one is a performing art of the human body involving musculature and body composition, with again a performance component to it with the posing. So it's really like any other performing art, and that's the best description of it instead of a sport, because it's not a sport. It's nothing like a sport. It has nothing in common with sports, and it's so weird that people try to call it that. And I think the only reason people try to push it that way is because they want it to be recognized as a sport, because Joe Weider, back before he died, tried to get bodybuilding put into the Olympics. Now, that's going to be a joke, because they even started trying to drug test a little bit on the bodybuilders. And these guys didn't know how to beat drug tests, and so the first year I think they tried to make them do drug testing. The guys all came in 30 or 40 pounds lighter with more body fat. It was kind of funny. But Joe Weider tried to make it an Olympic sport is what he wanted, and that's never going to fly because, one, it's completely a performing art with no clearly determined standards for how it's judged and won outside of what the judges seem to understand. And the fact that the drug abuse is rampant, not just a little bit, not just the amounts Olympic athletes squeeze through every year, because most of them are on too. But we're talking apples to oranges there, because bodybuilding requires abuse of excessive, insane amounts to even be competitive. And so it's never going to fly in the Olympics, but that's what he wanted. But because of that, Joe Weider started trying to call it a sport. And that's kind of stuck on in that community of everyone thinking of it as a sport, and they keep calling it that, when in reality, it's not a sport by any definition or traditional definition of the word, but what it is a performing art. And that would probably be a better term for it, because it really is. It's artistic in nature. It's not objective like a sport is. So you guys would do better who are fans of it, and it would make more sense, and you'd be using a better term if you simply called it a performing art instead of a sport. Competitive performing art. Just like certain types of competitive dance, just like certain types of competitive other things, painting, and entering a contest with your painting or your film that you make at a film festival. That's really what it's the equivalent of. But just like some of those are through motion and dance, some of them are on film and video, some of them are on canvas, and in this case, your canvas is the human body. And I think that would be a fair assessment rather than me completely disrespecting it, because I can disrespect it when you call it a sport, but when you call it a performing art, even I have to step back and go, okay, that's a good point. It is a legitimate performing art, and I think that's a fair name for it. But guys really need to quit calling it a sport and quit calling these guys athletes, because no athlete is almost dying and having to be on IVs and have to have all sorts of stuff injected to them sometimes just to keep them upright and mobile the last 24 hours before they actually compete in their endeavor. It is actually an anti-sport if you think of it in that regard, because all the competitors are pretty much dying and falling out and everything about the time they compete. They're at their weakest, their worst, and their most unhealthy when it comes to actual competition day. And that is the exact opposite of every single sport in the world. So again, it would be better if guys just quit calling it that. So when people come to me on a fitness channel where I do talk about fitness and I do talk about sports, and they say that I need to cover it because it's a sport, I have to look at them and go, are you fucking crazy? I don't cover ballet either. I don't cover interpretive dance, because they're performing arts, not sports. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.